Retro games that age well always bring us that wonderful feeling of nostalgia. Some of the games selected in this video are suggestions you left in the comments of the previous two top 10 incredible games you need to play videos. I'm sure you'll be familiar with some of them. Remember, the list is random, not in order of best to worst or vice versa. Every game you've never played is also a new game. In March this year, Super Metroid celebrated 30 years since its release. I've been owing you this game because Super Metroid is a successful classic from the 90s and is undoubtedly an incredible game you need to play. The title is mainly remembered for its level design, built to give the player a constant sense of discovery. Super Metroid is about getting lost in its maze. In the vast interconnected world of Zeeves, Samus Aran must, as always, reacquire her abilities and collect new items to progress in the game. Getting stuck more than once is completely normal. The player often wonders, what am I doing wrong? How do I proceed? Honestly, this is a mechanic I really like in retro games, although it gave me some headaches back in the day, I won't lie. I even took a while to adapt to the control mechanics. Super Metroid is one of the few games whose gameplay is simple, just back and forth. The game is difficult, especially when facing the bosses, so if you've never played it before, I'm sure it will be a long challenge for you. The soundtrack is cool, but I don't see anything extraordinary in it. If you also played Super Metroid on the Super Nintendo, I'm sure you have a lot of affection for this 90s gem. This is a game known by many, and in the previous videos, many people missed me, not including The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Therefore, it is a pleasure to include such a nostalgic and beloved game in this list. In 1998, Nintendo released The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time for the powerful Nintendo 64, being the fourth best-selling game on the console. Unlike The Legend of Zelda, A Link to the Past from the wonderful Super Nintendo, Link can now roll, jump, lock onto enemies, etc., elements that were extremely important for the game's gameplay. Not to mention the epic battles and brilliant puzzles the game offers. Many people complain about the Nintendo 64 controller, but many of the game's innovations were only possible thanks to the design of that controller, which with a larger number of buttons offered more possibilities for the development team. The Nintendo 64 cartridges had only 64 megabytes of storage, which was already little for the time, but Nintendo almost performed a miracle by managing to fit such a large game into that cartridge. Despite the somewhat blocky graphics, I believe it's still very worthwhile to play a retro game that has aged, as well as The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. The gameplay is so brilliant that I believe most Zelda series games today are modeled after this Nintendo 64 classic. Got some free time? Play The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. If there's a great FPS game I played on the PlayStation 2, it was Black. Black was certainly a game ahead of its time. Just starting the game, you can already see windows being shattered. And not just windows, but other parts of the scenery can also be destroyed. That was something amazing for the time. But that wasn't all. The gunfire sounds were already very realistic, including when reloading the weapon. It's the kind of game that if you put on headphones, you forget about the world around you. Players can only carry 2 weapons at a time. Therefore, strategy is needed in choosing weapons, which have different characteristics. The player can also carry grenades, which can be thrown without switching weapons. Landmines and grenades can be detonated prematurely by shooting them. Game is mission-based, with each mission separated by a live-action video.
I'm not sure I follow.
Training camps in Afghanistan, freelance guerrilla group in the Philippines with American advisor.
In higher difficulties, there are more objectives that must be completed before the player can progress, just like the classic 007 on the Nintendo 64. And I always found these missions a standout feature. The game is called Black because the protagonist is a Black Ops agent of the CIA, Sergeant First Class Jack Keller, played by Marty Papazian. I played this game on the PlayStation 2, but it came out in a slightly prettier version for the original Xbox, which is more powerful, and it was also released for the Xbox 360. In this case, play on any platform, but just play. Black is short, but it's fun from start to finish, besides having a good story.
Get me some fucking covering fire!
The Gran Turismo series has set a high standard of quality from its early days to the most current releases. Gran Turismo is one of the most iconic and beloved racing game series in the world of video games. With its realistic racing simulation and a wide variety of cars and tracks, players had the opportunity to experience the thrill of speed like never before. To this day, the franchise is considered one of the most important in the genre. The first Gran Turismo was released for the PlayStation in 1997, created by Takeshi Yokouchi. The game was so detailed and well-crafted that it took 5 years to be completed, a considerable time for the 90s, when it usually took about 2 years to produce a long game. Gran Turismo is not just about putting a car on the track and racing. From the beginning, the intention was to give the player the feeling of really being inside the car, feeling the brake, the accelerator, and the difficulties of the curves, where the weight and model of the car directly influence the experience. Due to its initial success, the production of new games in the series did not stop. The most recent release was in 2022 for PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5. In fact, the game's realistic approach is so impressive that many no longer call it a game, but a racing simulator. This is even addressed in the Gran Turismo movie, which I recently watched and highly recommend for its quality. Choosing a game from this franchise for our retro games list was not an easy task. I recommend the first Gran Turismo for the PlayStation 1 because, besides being loved by many, it is the best-selling game on the console, with over 11 million copies. Another excellent option is Gran Turismo 4 for the PlayStation 2. Gran Turismo 4 is acclaimed for its extremely realistic approach, taking it to another level in terms of car physics and track behavior. The game offers a precise driving simulation, considering elements such as weight, inertia, traction, and aerodynamics. Another racing game, this time from the Super Nintendo, not as famous and well-known as Gran Turismo, but also a great option, especially since it's a list of incredible games you need to play. The first Top Gear definitely needs to be on this list. Released in 1992, the game was developed by Gremlin Graphics and published by Kemco. In Japan, the game is known as Top Racer. In this Top Gear, we can choose one of 4 cars, each with its own characteristics, and 3 levels of difficulty that, over time, challenged me in the hardest mode of all. We always play on a split screen, as you can see, and there are 32 tracks in total, spread across 8 different countries. The thing is, in this game, if you finish after 5th place, it's game over immediately, unless you're in multiplayer mode, in which case your partner can save your gameplay. From this list, it is definitely the game with the most beautiful soundtrack. I still listen to the songs from this game on my smartphone to this day. A game that marked my childhood a lot, and I had a lot of fun with my brothers when I was a kid. Don't just stick to Gran Turismo. Give Top Gear a chance. Among retro fighting games, Mortal Kombat was a hit in the 90s, and to this day, for many, the franchise's classics are indispensable. I could include Mortal Kombat 3, but Midway made a huge mistake by not including the ninjas, later releasing a DLC for Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 with the ninjas included, making the game wonderful. Despite Mortal Kombat 2 being an incredible version, there are additional elements in Ultimate MK3 that make all the difference and justify its inclusion on this list. We have never before seen combo sequences, the running mechanic, the speed of the characters, and, for the first time, the famous brutality and animality.
Brutality. Animality.
Moreover, There are more playable characters and many other new features. The game was released in 1995 for arcades, but the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis also had their versions, with some reductions to fit the performance of both consoles. However, the arcade version is undoubtedly the best of all. Here we don't have Goro or Kintaro, but for the first time, we have Motaro, who is a boss as challenging as no other. There is the appearance of incredible ninjas that always captivated me in MK, and the sensational lines of the characters. I know that when I talk about Mortal Kombat, nostalgia hits me hard, but if you've never played it, give this gem from the 90s a chance. Tekken 3 was the first Tekken I played on my PlayStation 1. The game combines an improved combat system with a dark storyline. Bandai Namco sold over 8 million copies of the game, and it was the last title released on the PlayStation. Recently, Tekken 8 was released, but the Tekken that marked my childhood and brought me a lot of fun was Tekken 3. In my opinion, there is no better 3D fighting game than Tekken to this day, and I see no reason for that to change. Tekken 3 may seem graphically poor, but at the time, it was incredible and had excellent graphics, especially if you compare it to its predecessors, where the graphical quality shows significant differences. Tekken 1 and 2 were graphically far below Tekken 3. The gameplay is a bit slow, and don't expect a game with 60 frames per second like today's fighting games. I always liked playing with Eddie Gordo, the capoeira fighter. Each character has their own story, and the game had very beautiful animations for the time that left me in awe. I think it's a retro game worth at least testing, as I believe the Tekken franchise truly flourished, starting from Tekken 3. One of Capcom's best franchises is undoubtedly Resident Evil. Despite its ups and downs, the classic Resident Evil games have marked a generation. It's hard to choose just one to include in this list, so I selected some of the most emblematic ones. Starting with the first Resident Evil, but in this case, I recommend playing the Resident Evil 1 remake, released for the Nintendo GameCube. Back then, Nintendo had a deal with Capcom to release Resident Evil games first for Nintendo, and the Resident Evil 1 remake has an incredible graphical difference compared to the PS1 version. It's much prettier, and its graphics are still impressive to this day. If you don't have a GameCube, the same version was released for the PS4.
Wait! Don't shoot!
Get down!
Another Resident Evil is the classic 2, which for many is the best of all.
It'll be a lot safer.
Of course, the remake came out, which is amazing. But this Resident Evil 2 remake doesn't count as a retro game. And despite the graphical difference, it's still very worth playing if you haven't done so already. Here, the iconic characters Leon and Claire were born. I remember when I played Resident Evil 2 for the first time, I finished it on the same day, of course with the help of the extinct memory card. Resident Evil 3 was marked by the great and iconic enemy of STARS, Special Tactics and Rescue Service of the Raccoon City Police, Nemesis. What an awesome villain. Every room I entered, I was afraid Nemesis would appear, and I wouldn't be able to run away in time. However, I advise playing only the classic Resident Evil 3, as Capcom really dropped the ball with the remake, which fell far short of expectations. It might even warrant an entire video just to talk about that. But which Resident Evil do you prefer?
If you can believe me, then join us.
Chrono Trigger is undoubtedly an RPG game loved and cherished by many who played it in the 90s. I've already talked about Chrono Trigger here on the channel, about how impressive this RPG was. Released in 1995 for my beloved Super Nintendo, it was produced by SquareSoft before it became Square Enix. Chrono Trigger was already a beautiful game for its time, with a long story, great soundtrack, and multiple endings that were a big differentiator. Chrono Trigger begins in 1000 AD with Chrono, Marl, and Lucca. Chrono is the silent protagonist, characterized as a fearless young man who uses a katana in battle. Marl, Princess Nadia, lives in Guardia Castle. Despite her comfortable life, she likes to conceal her royal identity, and as the story progresses, it goes far beyond that, and could make for a video just about this game. There have been rumors for a while about a possible remake of this game, and honestly, I think such a rumor is true. There are many fan requests for a Chrono Trigger remake, and if you haven't played it on the Super Nintendo, it was also released for the PS1 and the Nintendo DS. Otherwise, you can use an emulator, but regardless of how you play it, just play it. Remember that every game you haven't played is also a new game. I talked a bit more about this game in another video here on the channel. Super Double Dragon is a 2D street fighting beat-em-up game, developed by Technos and published by the company in Japan and by TradeWest in the United States and Europe. The original Double Dragon pioneered cooperative mode in beat-em-up games in 1987 and influenced an entire generation of games. The story follows brothers Billy and Jimmy in a post-apocalyptic New York City, devastated by a nuclear war, taken over by gangs and criminal factions. The duo will have to beat up everyone in their way after Marion, Billy's girlfriend, is kidnapped by the criminals of the Black Warriors gang, who demand the secrets of their fighting style. The gameplay of this game was always a differentiator, not just because of its difficulty, but also because of the variety of moves. Here, we can counter-attack knowing the exact moment the enemy will strike. The game is quite reminiscent of old movies from the 80s and 90s, bringing a good dose of nostalgia. Super Double Dragon has excellent replay value, and since I know that many people still don't know it, it's very worth including in this list. Additionally, you don't need a Super Nintendo or emulator to play it, as Super Double Dragon has been released on various platforms. I'll stop here, and hope you enjoyed the list. Obviously, there are many other retro games to add, and if you feel some are missing, know that I already made 2 previous videos here on the channel and will leave them as recommendations for you to watch. See you in the next video, and feel free to comment on whatever you want about the video.